Hello, welcome to our webinar on the first days of school, a survival kit for SLPs. I'm Debbie Loso and I'm an SLP and have worked in the public schools for over 35 years and I'm here today to just give you some tips, hopefully things that will help you get started in your school year. And I've also worked with a team of folks from Cobb Pediatric Therapy Services to develop this webinar for you. For our learning outcomes, we want therapists to be able to define their roles and responsibilities during the first weeks of the school year, and be able to choose the best individual organizational style for caseload management. And we will give you a selection of examples for data collection. We want therapists to be able to define how performing file reviews for each student on their caseload will help them with lesson planning and addressing student needs. And finally, we want therapists to be able to develop a system for therapy plans and attendance and for keeping that critical information on students throughout the school year. So you're starting back to school. This might be your first time working in a public school or possibly your first job ever. But either way, we want to help you get ready to go back to school. So our major categories that we're going to talk about today are how to get started, some tips on scheduling, ideas for caseload management, how some sample tools for data collection, and then we want to encourage you to jump into action and get the school year running. Hope it's off to a good start. So you walk into your new school. What do you need to find? Of course, kind of a no-brainer, your room, and most likely a map of the school. And then you're going to want to get a master list of your students by grade and teacher. And then you will want some master schedules of PE, lunch, and art, usually by grade. And it may depend on what level you're in. Elementary, it's usually a master schedule for the whole school, but in middle school or high school, it may be your individual student schedule that has all the information you need to know. And then you're going to want to locate the SLP files. And we'll talk a little bit more about those files in a minute. So who will help me? Who are the critical folks that can help me get started? Always we want you to know who your Cobb Pediatric Therapy Services Director of Clinical Management is. And we've listed them there. Most likely you've already been in contact with them. But if for some reason you're not sure, you can always call our main office, and there's the number down there. To find out and definitely make that contact. And then often if we have a number of therapists in a district or school, we may have a lead therapist from Cobb Pediatric Therapy Services, or there might be a lead therapist from your school district. And either way, you want to know who both of those are because they can help you a lot. There's usually a coordinator with the district that might be a special education director or assistant director, or it could be a supervisor or coordinator for the speech and language program. And then you also want to find out are there any other SLPs, OTs, or PTs in your school? Because often these folks in these therapy positions can help you out. And then find out if there's a team leader in your school, like a team leader for special ed or a team leader for SLPs in your area, and they can be helpful as well. So the first days of school, what materials do you have? You want to kind of find out if there's an inventory or bank of materials, and then you might need to order supplies. Often the school will let you know or send around a form for you to order supplies that you might need. And then you want to make sure if you're bringing in your personal therapy items that your name is on them, and you know, any extra materials so that they don't get confused with the school materials. It's a good idea to start drafting a letter that would go home to the parents, introducing yourself, giving your contact number and email, and offering to talk with them if they wish. And then you want to start, once you've located those SLP files, you want to start a file review, trying to get to know all of your students. Most school districts have three sets of files, and it's kind of important that you know where they are, where they're located. So there's usually a working file, and this is what an SLP um, usually keeps in his or her therapy room. And often it's not a complete file. If a student's in multiple special education programs, the file may only have the critical information that the SLP needs, whereas somewhere in your school will be a complete IEP and school file. Typically, that's housed in the special education office or a central place, central file locking file cabinet in your school. So find out if there's any working files that the SLP kept, and then find out if there's a school kind of central file where all programs, you know, contribute to and put in that folder. And then most likely there's also an original file. Often that is found in the central office of the school district. It could be in electronic in an electronic version, but find out what the policy is there, because sometimes as you develop documents, sometimes you'll need to send them to the central file. Or if a document's missing, you can contact someone in the records room and may be able to locate the document for you in the central file. Okay, so now you want to do a file review, and like I said, it's going to depend on the kind of file that's available to you. So you find maybe the SLP working files and you notice that the current IEP is not in there, or some things might be missing. So then you may want to locate the complete file that's in the special ed office or somewhere in your school, and kind of look through that to see what you might need. Records, even the working file or the school file, complete school file, may include teacher notes, could be an anecdotal note or something about an incident or communication with the parent, can include progress reports, updating progress, usually as often as the classroom teacher updates progress or sends out a report card. Report cards, as I just mentioned, could be in there, achievement tests, discipline reports, evaluations and reports done by the school district. So here might be the speech and language evaluation as well as some other evaluations like the psychologists or psychological and the other special education documents, and sometimes something called an eligibility report, although that may be called different things in different school districts. You might see some reports from medical doctors. You should see the individual education program or IEP. And if the student has considerable behavior challenges, then you may see the behavior intervention plan or BIP in there. Some states and school districts call the IEP documents admission, review, and dismissal, or ARD. So just become aware of what the terminology is in the school district you're working in. And then there might be a graduation plan. Students who are 16 and older are required to have some kind of graduation plan and looking at what they will do after they leave high school, and usually has some career plans in there or college, and a summary of the student's performance towards meeting that graduation plan. So many documents can be in that file that you take a look at, but they do definitely give you a picture of what your student might be. Um, I always, when I sit down to review files, I always make sure that I have um, a notepad or index cards or something that I'm going to take notes on and keep in my working file so that I can, remember these individual students. Um, so you want to, as you're getting familiar with the students on your caseload, you also want to find out about passwords and electronic access to IEPs. Sometimes it takes a week or two to get those passwords, but just keep working on, find out who you need to contact, and then read through the student files. Obtain all the information that you need on those students. You want to know about their background, their grade level, disorder area, any other specific. And then most people also need to know where to get the information on students when you need to contact the parents or send something home or double check. So even if you don't necessarily want to keep the name, address, date of birth, social security number, parents' names, contact numbers, you may not want to copy all those down at once. You do want to know where to find it, that information for when you need it. And so now as you're doing your file review, some of the most important things to look at are reading through the IEP, making a note of any important dates, annual review, reevaluations, knowing your student's background, therapy history, goals, and objectives. Sometimes there's something critical there where maybe a student was placed in the program for Artic and language and had Artic and language goals for a while, and then all of a sudden the Artic goals are gone. And so you want to read through and find out, okay, did that mean student achieved all their goals, that they don't need to work on Artic anymore? Does it mean that they reached a point of maximum progress and so they've decided to discontinue or just monitor? There are things that happen in therapy as students progress, and you want to check on that. A lot of times that information can be in the minutes for placement and can include instructions for, how the student is supposed to receive their services, if they're not supposed to be pulled out from reading, or if they, how much time in therapy, what kind of delivery model, any special considerations might be found in those minutes. And then you need to know the dates and have a good calendar system. Really, you shouldn't walk into work the first week of school without a calendar. And the first things you want to know are things like orientation meetings, district-wide trainings. I know in my old district, we often had a new SLP meeting where we could go over things that were important that we wanted our new folks to know. There's often a global new teacher orientation meeting or that's offered by the district. There are often IEP training meetings, so you can get that training right away. Medicaid training, put them all on your calendar. And another kind of important thing, once you get into that IEP system, most of the time those electronic IEP systems will print out a list of IEP due dates for your caseload. So find out about that. You may not have to make a note, may not have to make jot down dates from the file, but rather can look them up electronically and then put them in your calendar. So as we were talking, of course, we need a total school year calendar. And sometimes you can buy them for the school year. Sometimes you have to buy the two different years, 2015 and 2016 separately and put them together. But make sure you have a calendar for the whole year and that you put down future meetings as they come up or as you learn about them. And then know when progress reports are due. Most of the time you can go to the school district's website and print out a school district calendar, and it will tell you when progress reports are coming out. So you can put those down because part of the law in IDEA 2004 says that parents would receive progress reports on their students as often as general ed teachers send out report cards or progress reports. So when they send one out, we have to send one out about their IEP goals and their progress. Know when annual reviews are due. Like I said, you may be able to print those out by month from your IEP system, electronic IEP system. If not, you need to make a handwritten one or type in those dates on your calendar. Keeping up with a calendar is really an important thing as an SLP. Here we have um, just kind of a pathway that tells you about navigating the individualized education program process. And it starts with pre-referral and goes all the way through the end of the year when a student has been in received IEP services for a whole year. And this is just important to kind of think of because it points out that there's a pathway. There's a logical progression as a student is identified as having a possible problem, speech and language problem it could be, or others, and then how the student goes through a pre-referral process where they receive some interventions, and then after a certain point they are referred for special education, which could include speech, which does include speech and language, and then getting consent from the parent, then evaluating the student, and there's a timeline for that. For example, 60 days from when the parent gives consent, and then completing the evaluation, setting up an IEP meeting, holding that within 30 days, implementing the IEP meeting, and then a year from the start of the IEP, having an annual review to review progress and um, develop new goals and objectives as needed. So, one thing that's helpful that we have on Cobb Connects, our learning management system, is a webinar on IDEA that takes you through the most important components. So, I want to encourage you to visit that. So, okay, so now we've been through the pre-planning days in the school district, and we are at the first week of school. The first week that students come to school, that is. And often schools have procedures for pulling students for special services the first week of school. So just check it out for your school. You want to do what everybody else does. So if they say don't pull students during the first week, but just go visit their classrooms, that might be what you need to do. Others might say, oh, yes, it's fine to pull students. Just start checking with the teachers about their schedules or whatever. The first week of school, you should try to see all your students, even though you may not have a true schedule. And again, it might be that you're just visiting their classrooms and saying hello and introducing yourself, or maybe pulling them out in the hall to talk to them for a couple minutes. Or it may be that you're actually pulling them to your therapy room, showing them where your therapy room is and, talking to them about their schedules, whatever. Um, as you're going through the first week, you should start planning what you would do your first session with each of your groups of students. Now, you may do, just come up with some simple questions like, tell me about yourself. What are your therapy goals? What did you work on in therapy last year? What did you do over the summer? What's your best subject or your worst subject and why? So just some kind of uh, um, questions that would help you get to know them. Sometimes, especially when I've worked with older students, I'll make a little interview form and ask them to fill out some of it, but we'll talk through it as a group also. And then I'll just hold on to that because it helps me remember some important things about that student. The second week, you should be trying to serve all of your students through a rough draft of a schedule, knowing that not everything's going to work out right away. And this would be a good time if you bring them to your therapy room to set some expectations for behavior. And I have a chart on the next slide that just kind of gives you an example of 5 simple rules that kids should follow when they're in your therapy room. And then the third week, you should be following a schedule, even though it may not be finalized, but you should be working on finalizing it by the third week. Now, there are special considerations in each school, and sometimes I've worked in a school where they totally changed all the special education schedules the first or second week of school. So we understand that there may be things beyond your control that keep you from having a finalized schedule. But do make sure you're seeing your kids, even if it's not all of their IEP time, but so that people know that you've gotten started and you're seeing kids. Here's an example of a rule chart that you might want to have in therapy. And I always think it's important to add a picture or something that helps clarify what you mean by each of the rules. The first one, be respectful, was a little bit hard to find a good picture for. So I actually went to a little chart that I found on the internet that explains what respect is. Respect means I want people to treat, I treat people the way I want them to treat me. And then, and these are all things that are teachable. So you might use these to start out to teach the kids the rules in therapy and how we work in a group and discuss things or whatever. And there's certainly many variations of this. It's up to you to just develop one that works for you and your students. And then we start talking about scheduling. And here are some scheduling tips. If you were sitting down for the first time to schedule, then you might want to look at how you can group students, especially by grade and the kind of therapy issue they're having. You can't always put all the language kids with language who have with language problems. You can't always put all the fluency kids with other students who have fluency problems. So you want to work through that and kind of develop, the best groups you can. You want a master schedule to identify any problem times, like all second grade is in PE from 9 to 10. So you don't want to put second grade groups in your schedule at that time. You want to check with special education teachers, especially self-contained teachers first, and see what their schedules are like. Often they can help you work around issues for scheduling, but check with them first. They also may have a community day where kids go out for community-based training, and so you don't want to schedule them on Friday because they won't be there. Don't give teachers a totally open choice. Give them two or three choices for times when you're trying to confirm if a time would work or not work. Um, Once you have a working schedule or a finalized schedule, you want to send copies of the schedule with the student's names highlighted to each teacher who would have that student during speech. You want to share a copy with your school administrator and your lead, and you want to show teachers that you're thankful or, you appreciate their cooperation. And then eventually, sometime early on, you want to post a schedule minus students' last names on the wall in your therapy room so that when people need to find you, they know where you are or when your next group's coming in. And there is a webinar on Cobb Connects on scheduling tips. So you also might want to take a look at that. Um, In trying to manage our caseloads, there are a couple of things that are very important. Looking at our data collection methods, having a method to keep attendance, who received therapy that day, and lesson plans. And lesson plans come in many different formats. Your school may not require them. It may be just a few notes about what you did each time, each session you met, but do look into that. Find out if the school has a policy on that. And then we find it's very efficient if you keep it in a loose leaf notebook so that you can open and close it, add things, take things out as they're needed, and find a manageable data collection system uh, and start using it right away. And we have examples of some of those on as resources and handouts going with this webinar. Um, we mentioned having a system for documenting attendance, and then looking at getting baseline data during the first couple therapy sessions so that you have a good baseline on where your student started out, and that will help you throughout the school year. You may want to ask if your county has or district has specific forms to use for each of these. Um, okay, so setting up your caseload management notebook. And again, we can't stress enough that to be successful as a school-based therapist, you've got to be able to manage the multiple requirements of the job. And along with monitoring your student progress, there's all kinds of documentation, keeping up with IEPs and other important dates, completing paperwork in a timely manner, communicating with parents, and most importantly, providing well-planned, effective therapy instruction to your students. So that's really the most important, but sometimes we become overwhelmed with all the other things that we've got to do. So we have been recommending for a long time that you have a caseload management notebook. Um, and that this is a good way to keep most of the really important things at your fingertips for you to use as you go throughout your week. Um, I kept one notebook, and when I was itinerant, I would take it to each of my schools, have all my information, and then sometimes, depending on how stable my therapy room was, if it was really mine, I might have a separate notebook for each school. But the problem with that is that sometimes a date or um, a deadline would come up at my other school and my notebook is back at my other school. So I don't know, something to think about. Okay, what should go in that notebook? Well, your caseload and your calendar, and usually there's a printout that someone from the district or the software program in your school prints out a list of students on your caseload. And then you want your weekly schedule. You want your attendance systems for how you're documenting that your students came to therapy or received therapy. And if they didn't, then you want to jot down a note about why they didn't receive therapy that day. You probably, want the year at a glance calendar that we've been talking about. And then many therapists also include a school calendar just so they can keep up with what's going on. Just print one off the website. And then we also usually you want to keep your lesson planning and progress monitoring sheets in there. And some people have their data sheet and their lesson plan as one form, and that's perfectly okay. Some people use different forms for data collection than lesson planning, and some use the same form for all three things: lesson planning, data collection, and attendance. So it just depends on, the format that you're most comfortable with. We also need, I usually put copies of their progress reports in my notebook. If you have a really high caseload and that becomes too bulky or burdensome, you could put the progress reports in the working SLP file. There might be something for Medicaid documentation that you want to keep in there. It just depends on, your situation. And then you may also want to have your RTI and referral logs in there so you can keep track of who are you working with on RTI, who has been referred for an evaluation, where you are in completing that evaluation and getting the components that are needed to complete the assessment or the evaluation, and anything else that you think might be necessary or helpful in your notebook. Then let's talk just a little bit more about baseline data. As you go through each goal and objective, you want to collect data on their present level of performance. You want to do this now or early on, not to wait too long into the school year. And this is what's going to help you start to show progress in therapy. So examples of data collection forms are available through the handouts for this webinar in Cobb Connects. And after you take baseline data on objectives, begin to think of your plan to address goals and objectives in therapy. Choose a data collection form or system, as we talked about from your caseload management notebook. This is just an example of one where they print out the name, date, activity, and objective number and the data on mailing labels. And then as they work with the student, they use this one-page data collection form and with the objectives already listed. And then they put sticky labels on the page and on the back as they work with the student. So it's kind of the labels are often on a clipboard. And so it just makes it very easy at the end of the day or at the end of a couple sessions to go in and stick those in their data collection, on their data collection page. In lesson planning, we always say to follow the expectations at your school as far as regarding lesson plans and how to do them or what format they need to look like. Plan activities and themes, but always be flexible. There's always a chance that something is going to change the schedule that day or someone's not there, and feel free to get creative at times to and adjust as you need to. Try to plan ahead. Try to determine which goals and objectives to work on each day or each week. And, good therapists find a way to balance the need for data collection and best instruction. So think about that. We can't always stop instruction or therapy so that we can go write things down. So you have to find a good system for you. Use classroom themes, curriculum standards, and grade level textbooks when possible so that you can build that connection to the classroom in your lesson plans. And see Cobb Connects for examples of lesson plan formats. So what goes into a therapy lesson plan? You have to kind of think through which goals and objectives are you going to target, what are the student activities, what materials are needed, and what's the length of time for each activity. For example, when I worked with preschoolers, I found that they 10 minutes was pretty much the max of the amount of time they could stay on one activity and then kind of run out of enthusiasm. So when I worked with preschoolers, if I had a 30-minute session, I often had three different activities, each lasting about 10 minutes. So it depends on your students and what they need. Then think through how do you want to introduce a topic? Do you review or summarize information leading up to that topic from previous sessions? How can you help the student see how it affects him or her individually relating to their own life experiences? Help make it meaningful in their life. How do you present new learning? How do you summarize what we learned today? How do you address multiple IEP objectives? So all things to think about as you develop a plan. And then think about your attendance taking. Note when kids are absent, note the reason for the absence, including if the therapist was absent, and then keep attendance logs in your caseload management notebook. Okay, so what we want to do is encourage you to jump into action. We hope your new school year is off and running in a very positive way. And for the start of the school year, just right now, as you're thinking through everything, find out three names and contact information for your primary sources of information or support within your district to help you get started. Hope you have a great year.